May 1945. Across Germany, entire cities burned through the night. Factories stood silent. Railway stations were packed with refugees. And the roads of the collapsing Third Reich had become rivers of fear. Old men pushed broken carts through mud. Women carried children wrapped in blankets. Exhausted German soldiers wandered westward with empty rifles and hollow faces. Above them, Allied aircraft still roared across the skies like a reminder that the war was already decided. But among the millions trying to escape the ruins of Germany, there were certain men who feared capture more than anyone else. Not ordinary soldiers, not starving civilians, but the officers of the Waffen-SS. And among the most feared names in that collapsing empire was SS General Sepp Dietrich. Years earlier, Dietrich had stood near Adolf Hitler himself. He commanded elite SS forces. His men fought with fanatic loyalty. And throughout occupied Europe, the black SS uniform inspired fear everywhere it appeared. But now, Germany was collapsing, and the same officers who once terrified Europe were beginning to understand something horrifying. The Americans were coming. And somewhere among those advancing armies was General George S. Patton. Even before the war ended, Patton's name carried a strange psychological weight across Europe. German officers respected him. Civilians feared him. And Allied soldiers often described him like a force of nature instead of a man. He moved fast, attacked hard, and demanded relentless pressure against the enemy. But for members of the SS, Patton represented something even worse: humiliation. Because Patton had absolutely no admiration for Nazi fanaticism, especially not for the Waffen-SS, to him, many SS leaders represented arrogance without honor. And by 1945, hatred toward the SS was spreading rapidly through Allied ranks, especially after concentration camps began falling into American hands. Nothing prepared American soldiers for what they found there. Nothing. Rows of bodies, starving prisoners, human beings barely alive. Entire camps surrounded by the smell of death. Battle-hardened American troops who had survived Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge openly wept after entering some camps. Others became silent, furious, and from that moment onward, many SS officers realized something terrifying. The Americans connected them to these horrors. Their famous uniforms would no longer protect them. For years, Sepp Dietrich had lived like a powerful man. His orders moved divisions across Europe. His name carried influence inside Hitler's inner military structure. Young SS soldiers admired him. Nazi propaganda celebrated commanders like him as symbols of German strength. But power during wartime can disappear very quickly, especially when an empire collapses. And by spring 1945, the illusion of Nazi invincibility had shattered completely. Berlin was surrounded. German communication lines were failing. Fuel shortages crippled entire units. Some soldiers abandoned vehicles and continued on foot. Others simply surrendered the moment they saw American armor. Even senior German officers no longer spoke confidently about victory. Now they spoke about survival. And survival often meant only one thing: reach the Americans before the Soviets arrive. Because rumors from the Eastern Front terrified German troops. Stories of revenge, executions, disappearances. And suddenly, many SS officers who once preached fanatic loyalty to Hitler were desperately trying to surrender in the West instead. That included men connected to Sepp Dietrich's world. As the Reich collapsed, panic spread quietly through SS leadership circles. Some officers burned records. Others removed insignia from their uniforms. A few even tried disguising themselves as ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, because by then everyone understood the truth. The SS had become toxic. Especially after Allied troops liberated camps across Germany. American soldiers returning from those camps told horrifying stories to other units. The emotional atmosphere changed almost overnight. This was no longer seen as just another military enemy. To many Allied soldiers, the SS now represented something darker, something unforgivable. And that terrified men like Sepp Dietrich, because powerful men fear judgment more than battle. Battle can be survived. Judgment lasts forever. The soldiers serving under Patton had their own reputation. They moved aggressively across Europe. Their armored columns advanced through broken German towns like unstoppable machines. Dust-covered Sherman tanks rolled through streets lined with frightened civilians. And everywhere they went, surrendering German troops poured toward American lines. But witnesses later described something noticeable about captured SS officers compared to ordinary German soldiers. The SS often looked deeply nervous. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others tried insisting they were only military men. But American soldiers had already seen too much, especially after camp liberations. And once the camps were discovered, sympathy became extremely rare. American troops were exhausted from years of war. Many had lost close friends during brutal battles against SS divisions. Others remembered the Battle of the Bulge and stories connected to SS brutality there. Hatred had hardened. And now the men who once marched proudly through Europe suddenly found themselves completely powerless. The collapse of Nazi Germany was not only military, it was psychological. And nowhere was that more visible than among captured SS officers. For years, these men lived inside a world built on power, fear, and absolute obedience. People stood when they entered rooms. Soldiers saluted instantly. Civilians lowered their eyes. But now, everything was reversed. American soldiers gave the orders. American guards controlled the roads. American tanks surrounded the cities. And SS commanders who once spoke with authority now waited quietly behind barbed wire. Witnesses from the final days of the war often described captured German officers as emotionally exhausted. Some stared blankly into the distance. Others smoked constantly. A few still tried appearing proud. But many looked like men who finally understood the world they built had collapsed forever. And among those prisoners, fear spread quickly whenever rumors about Patton circulated. Because Patton was not viewed as soft, he was viewed as relentless. Then came another terrifying realization for SS officers. The war ending did not necessarily mean safety. Across Europe, civilians who survived Nazi occupation were furious. Former prisoners wanted justice, and Allied troops themselves struggled emotionally after seeing the camps. Stories spread among captured Germans that some SS officers feared angry soldiers might kill them before official processing even began. Whether every rumor was true or not hardly mattered. Fear itself was enough. And this is where the psychological meaning behind begging for mercy truly begins. Not necessarily dramatic movie-style begging, but terrified requests for protection, for fair treatment, for survival, for avoidance of revenge. Because the mighty SS leadership now understood something chilling. The people they once terrorized finally held power over them. By the final weeks of the war, Sepp Dietrich could see the reality surrounding him. The Reich was gone. Hitler's empire was collapsing into smoke and rubble. Millions were dead, and the officers who once believed themselves untouchable were becoming prisoners of history. For a man who once stood near the center of Nazi power, The humiliation was enormous. No cheering crowds, no military parades, no speeches, only defeat, only uncertainty, only fear about what would happen next. And somewhere in that atmosphere of collapse, many SS leaders desperately hoped respected American commanders might prevent chaos and revenge killings during surrender situations. Patton's authority mattered enormously in occupied territory. His soldiers obeyed him. His officers respected him. And prisoners understood that if Patton wanted discipline maintained, discipline would be maintained. But if he showed contempt toward them, everyone would feel it. Imagine the atmosphere in Germany during those final surrender days. Burned vehicles beside country roads, white surrender flags hanging from shattered windows, long lines of prisoners walking silently beneath armed guards, and among them, officers who once commanded entire divisions now carrying nothing except small bags and defeated expressions. American soldiers noticed the transformation immediately. The confidence was gone. The arrogance had faded. Even the famous SS image now looked weak and exhausted beneath the dust of defeat. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised dominance over Europe. Instead, the Third Reich ended with frightened officers waiting for mercy from the enemies they once mocked. That psychological reversal fascinated many American troops. Because they had spent years fighting men described as fearless fanatics, yet now, those same men looked deeply afraid. It is impossible to understand the fear of captured SS officers without understanding what Allied troops discovered in 1945. American soldiers entered camps and saw evidence of suffering on a scale difficult to describe. Even experienced combat veterans struggled emotionally afterward. Some soldiers later admitted they could barely sleep after what they witnessed. Others carried those memories for the rest of their lives. And because of those discoveries, captured SS personnel understood the atmosphere around them had permanently changed. This was not merely military defeat anymore. The world wanted accountability, and for many former Nazi officials, that possibility became terrifying, especially for officers connected to the Waffen-SS. Patton himself was a complicated man, aggressive, blunt, proud, but also deeply aware that Europe had witnessed catastrophic destruction. By 1945, even hardened commanders understood they were seeing the collapse of an entire civilization into violence and extremism. Cities destroyed, families erased, millions dead across continents. And at the center of that destruction stood the Nazi regime and its machinery of fanaticism. For men like Patton, victory was not simply about conquering territory anymore. It was about ending something dangerous before it consumed even more of the world. And perhaps that is why the downfall of powerful SS figures became so symbolic after the war. Because people across Europe watched men once feared by millions suddenly reduced to helpless prisoners. In the end, Sepp Dietrich survived the war, but survival did not mean victory. The empire he served collapsed completely. The uniforms lost their power, the speeches disappeared, and the fear that once protected Nazi leaders vanished almost overnight. Instead came investigations, trials, interrogations, public judgment, and perhaps the greatest humiliation of all, history remembering them not as conquerors, but as symbols of destruction. For American soldiers returning home in 1945, that memory stayed powerful for decades, not simply because Germany surrendered, but because they witnessed something rare in history, the complete collapse of arrogance. Men who once demanded obedience from entire nations, now asking their enemies for mercy. And for millions watching the war finally end, that felt like justice.